This ship did not exist on any map. It had no name in the radio waves. American intelligence considered it nothing more than a myth. It was built behind a wall of absolute silence. Workers were executed on the spot just for looking in the wrong direction. This was the most guarded secret of the Japanese Empire. The brother of the legendary Yamato, a 70,000-ton monster designed to change the course of the war. But instead of triumph, a catastrophe occurred that defies belief. The Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier in the history of World War II. It set out on its maiden voyage and vanished. 17 hours. That is exactly how long this Leviathan survived in the open sea. It never launched a single plane. It never fired a single shot from its massive guns. How is this possible? How did an unsinkable mountain of steel go to the bottom because of one single submarine, whose captain didn't even know what he was shooting at? Official history will tell you it was a torpedo attack, but the truth is much darker. Today, we are opening classified reports to reconstruct that night minute by minute. You will see how paranoia, haste, and one stupid engineering mistake destroyed the hope of an entire nation. Stay until the end. What the divers found will haunt you. To understand why this catastrophe was inevitable, we have to turn back the clock to August 1940. The whole world is already on fire, but in Japan, euphoria reigns. The Yamato is launched. 3 months later, its twin, the Musashi. You have to imagine the scale of these machines. These were not just ships. They were floating cities, encased in the thickest armor humanity had ever produced. Their main battery guns, 460 millimeters, could hurl a shell the size of a passenger car over 40 kilometers. The idea was simple. Japanese admirals believed these predators would roam the ocean and destroy the American fleet without ever getting close. American admirals certainly had reason to sweat. On the slipways, a third hull was already laid down, the most perfect one. It was called Hull 110, the future Shinano. It was supposed to be the third brother in this family of giants. But history loves cruel irony. While the Japanese were building their super battleships, the rules of war changed in a single day. June 1942, the Battle of Midway. It was a moment of truth. The massive guns proved useless. Everything was decided by aircraft. Japan lost the battle, losing 4 heavy aircraft carriers at once. It was a knockout blow. The Imperial Navy found itself at a dead end. Battleships instantly turned into dinosaurs watching the meteor fall. They desperately needed aircraft carriers, at any cost. The command turned its eyes toward Hull 110. It was half finished. The massive battleship hull was already standing in the dock. And then a decision was made that determined the fate of thousands. Engineers received the order: immediately convert the unfinished battleship into an aircraft carrier. Think about that. This wasn't a project designed from scratch. It was an attempt to crossbreed a bulldog with a rhino. They took the heaviest battleship armor, meant for artillery duels, and mounted a flight deck on top of it. The result was supposed to stun the world. The Shinano was planned as the largest aircraft carrier in history, a floating fortress. Designers swore it would be unsinkable. The armored deck was supposed to withstand direct hits from 500-kilogram bombs. Torpedoes? For its double bottom and massive anti-torpedo bulges, it was supposed to be like a mosquito bite. At least, that's how it looked on paper. But in reality, while trying to save the empire, the Japanese were creating the largest and most complex monster in naval history. And they decided to build it in an atmosphere of secrecy that bordered on madness. A wall grew around the shipyard in Yokosuka. A massive, solid wall that cut the dock off from the rest of the world. But that wasn't enough. The military police, the Kempeitai, established a brutal regime. Anyone caught nearby with a camera was considered a spy. The conversation was short. Execution on the spot. No trial, no investigation. The workers, thousands of engineers and welders, effectively became prisoners. They were moved to barrack status. They ate, slept, and worked right inside the dock, not leaving for months. They were forbidden from talking about what they were building, even with each other. In documents, this giant was referred to simply as Special Vessel. The level of secrecy was so extreme that it actually worked. American intelligence, which usually knew everything, was blind this time. Until the very end of the war, the Pentagon had no idea what kind of surprise the Japanese were preparing. On the satellite photos of that time, it would have looked like the construction of just another tanker or barge. No one saw the scale. But time was working against the empire. June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan loses 3 more aircraft carriers. It's a catastrophe. The fleet is bled dry. The imperial staff, in a panic, moves up the deadlines. The commissioning of the Shinano is moved from January 1945 to November 1944. A real hell began at the shipyard. Work shifts lasted 12 to 14 hours. Days off were canceled. People collapsed from exhaustion right at their machines, but the pace only increased. The quality of work dropped rapidly, but they turned a blind eye. The main thing was to deliver the ship. The future commander of the ship, Captain Toshio Abe, watched this madness with horror. He was an experienced sea wolf, and he understood. The ship was not ready. Abe wrote reports, begged the command for more time. He needed to conduct sea trials. He needed to train a crew that consisted of green recruits. To release such a complex mechanism into the sea without testing was suicide. But no one listened to him. The dispute was settled by American B-29 bombers. They began regular raids on Tokyo and Yokosuka. One lucky bomb could turn the unfinished Shinano into a pile of scrap metal right in the dry dock. The risk was too high. The order came immediately. The ship must leave. It was ordered to exit Tokyo Bay and move to the base in Kuri in the inland sea. There, under the cover of air defense, in calm waters, they planned to finish it. On October 8th, the hull was launched, and by November 19th, the flag of the rising sun was raised on the mast. Formally, the Shinano was commissioned into the fleet. In reality, it was a floating warehouse of construction materials with running engines. There were still workers on board, cables hung from the ceilings, and many bulkheads were not yet sealed. While Captain Abe stared into the black water, trying to spot danger, his fate was already waiting for him. But it looked nothing like he imagined. It wasn't an armada of bombers. It was a lonely, tired, and frankly bored American submarine. The USS Archerfish. On October 30th, she left Pearl Harbor for her next patrol. And to be honest, the crew was disappointed. They were assigned the most tedious task in the whole Navy: lifeguard duty. They were supposed to hang around a sector, transmit weather reports, and pick up downed B-29 pilots from the water. No torpedo attacks, no glory. Just waiting in the middle of a blank ocean. The boat's commander, Joseph Enright, was an ambitious man. He already had command experience, but his past patrols had been unsuccessful. He needed a win. He needed a kill. Instead, he got a job as a meteorologist. But on November 27th, everything changed. The radio operator picked up a coded message from headquarters. There would be no bomber raids on Japan for the next 48 hours. This meant no one needed saving. Enright caught the hint instantly. This was a carte blanche. 2 days of free hunting. Okay, boys, he told his officers. The Weather Bureau is closed. We're going to go look for trouble. November 29th. 8:48 p.m. The boat is on the surface, charging batteries. The ocean is calm. The moon appears and disappears behind the clouds. It's quiet on the bridge. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by the radar operator's voice. Sir, contact. Distance 12 miles. Bearing 30. What is it? Looks like an island, sir. Enright frowned. He knew the map by heart. There were no islands in this sector. He went down to the radar screen. The green dot was pulsing. Sir, the operator's voice trembled. The island is moving. Speed 20 knots. Enright felt a chill run down his spine. Islands don't move at the speed of a destroyer. It was a ship. And judging by the radar signature, a massive ship. His first thought was that it was a tanker, a very large oil tanker, a perfect, fat target. The battle station's siren wailed on the boat. Archerfish turned to give chase. But when they got closer, and Enright looked through the binoculars, he couldn't believe his eyes. The silhouette was strange. It looked like a mountain growing straight out of the water. It wasn't a tanker. It was something that wasn't in any U.S. Navy manual. On the bridge of the Shinano, they weren't sleeping either. At 10:45 p.m., almost simultaneously with the Americans, the Japanese radar post spotted an intruder. An operator reported an unidentified object behind them to Captain Abe. Abe immediately understood. This was no tanker or fishing boat. This was the enemy. At that moment, the captain faced the most important choice of his life. Engage in battle? He had 3 escort destroyers. They could have turned around, swept the sector, blasted the sub with depth charges, and sent the Americans to the bottom in 10 minutes. That would be logical for a warship. But Abe remembered his main order: get the Shinano to Kure at any cost. The carrier was naked. Without planes, with an untrained crew and workers in the holds, it was too vulnerable. One stray torpedo could be fatal. So Abe gave the only order that seemed reasonable. Full speed ahead. 70,000 tons of steel shivered. The giant turbines roared, and the water behind the stern began to boil. The Shinano began to pick up speed, disappearing into the darkness in a zigzag. The destroyers formed a tight ring around their ward. On board the Archerfish, the mood was completely different. Joseph Enright stood on the bridge, gripping the rails. Salt spray hit his face. The sub's 4 diesels were working at the limit, squeezing out every possible and impossible ounce of power. The boat shook with the strain, cutting through the waves. But it wasn't enough. Enright looked at the radar and saw the target dot relentlessly pulling away. It was simple math, and it was against him. Archerfish's top surface speed was 19 knots. The Shinano, even unfinished, could easily hit 27. The carrier was simply pulling away. In an hour, it would vanish over the horizon, leaving the Americans to swallow its exhaust. It seemed the race was lost. Enright cursed everything. To lose such a prize! He was already preparing to give the order to break off the pursuit when what Japanese engineers called a technical glitch, and historians would call a fatal error, occurred. Deep inside the Shinano, far below the waterline in the engine room, a howl erupted. It wasn't the sound of turbines, it was the scream of metal. The main bearing of a propeller shaft began to overheat. Remember the rush. Remember the canceled trials. If the ship had undergone a normal shakedown, this problem would have been identified and fixed in the dock. But now, at full speed, the shaft was spinning under a massive load it wasn't ready for. The temperature spiked critically. The mechanics reported to the bridge. "Captain, if we don't drop the RPM, the shaft will seize. We'll lose propulsion and be stuck in the middle of the ocean." This was a death sentence. Abe, gritting his teeth, was forced to give the order that killed his ship. Reduce speed, 18 knots. Reduce speed to 18 knots. Exactly what Enright needed to stay in the game. On the American radar screen, the receding dot suddenly froze. The distance stopped growing. Enright didn't know what happened to the Japanese. A fire? A breakdown? Or if they just decided to wait for their escort. He didn't care. He saw a chance. Archerfish continued the chase. Now they were neck and neck. But simply catching up wasn't enough. To fire torpedoes, the sub had to overtake the target, take a position ahead of its course, and submerge. In a surfaced position, attacking such an armada was suicide. The destroyers would have torn the boat apart with their guns before it even got into firing range. A long, grueling game of cat and mouse began, hour after hour, in total darkness. The Shinano zigzagged, changing course every few minutes to throw off the aim of any possible submarine. Enright, like an expert chess player, tried to predict the enemy captain's next move. He drew lines on the map, calculated angles, trying to understand the logic of the Japanese captain. If Abe turned left, he would get away. If he kept going straight, he would get away. But if he turned right into the crosshairs, The clock hit 3 a.m., the darkest hour before dawn. The Archerfish crew was exhausted. The radar operator's eyes were stinging from strain. The air inside the boat had become heavy and stale with the smell of sweat and diesel. Joseph Enright knew his chance was fading with every minute. The sun would rise soon. As soon as it got light, the Japanese destroyers would see his submarine on the surface and turn it into a sieve in seconds. He needed a miracle. He needed the Japanese captain to make a mistake. And Captain Abe made it. A zigzag is a standard anti-submarine maneuver. The ship moves not in a straight line, but in a broken one, changing course every 10 to 15 minutes. The idea is simple. If a sub is aiming at you, the course change will throw off its calculations. But there is one problem. A zigzag is Russian roulette. By turning, you might escape danger, or you might put your broadside right in front of a torpedo tube. At 300, Abe gave the order to the helmsman. Change course, turn southwest. On the bridge of the Archerfish, Enright held his breath. He watched the plotter. The line twitched. "Sir," the navigator shouted, "the target is changing course." "Where to?" "Right at us, sir." Enright couldn't believe his luck. The giant aircraft carrier, trying to confuse its trail, turned so that it was now intercepting the sub. The distance began to close rapidly. 60 cables, 50, 40. The Shinano was walking right into the lion's mouth. "Dive! Dive!" Enright commanded. "All stations, silent." The siren didn't wail. That would have given them away. Orders were passed in whispers and gestures. The hatches slammed shut. The ballast tanks filled with water, and the Archerfish slipped beneath the black surface of the ocean. Now they were blind. The only eye the boat had left was the periscope. Enright pressed his face to the eyepiece. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. In the moonlight, only a kilometer away, a mountain was moving. It wasn't a ship. It was a moving fortress wall that blotted out the horizon. He had never seen anything like it in his life. Even in a submariner's wildest dreams, he couldn't have imagined such a target. But there was a problem. One of the escort destroyers was moving right in front of the carrier's bow. It was so close that Enright could see the foam at its prow. If he fired now, the torpedo might hit the destroyer. Or worse, the destroyer would spot the periscope and attack. He had to wait. These were the longest seconds in the crew's lives. Enright had to let the bodyguard pass to hit the VIP. "Let the escort pass," he whispered. "Wait. Wait." The destroyer passed right over them. Its propellers thundered somewhere above. The noise was so loud it felt like the boat would fall apart. But the Japanese didn't hear them. They were too busy scanning the horizon, forgetting to look down. As soon as the noise of the destroyer's propellers began to fade, Enright raised the periscope again. Now there was only the clean, unprotected side of the Shinano. A massive, flat target the length of 3 football fields. It was impossible to miss. Tubes 1 through 6, ready. He decided not to hold back. He would fire the entire bow salvo, 6 torpedoes in a fan. To make sure. "Fire 1. The boat lurched. "Fire 2. "Fire 3. Every 8 seconds, fish shot out of the bow tubes, leaving a deadly trail behind. Enright looked at the stopwatch. The torpedoes needed 45 seconds to reach the target. The compartment was dead silent. Men froze, staring at the ceiling as if trying to hear the sound through the depth of the water. 40 seconds. 41. 42. 43. At 3:17, the silence of the ocean was ripped apart. The first torpedo hit the stern, destroying empty aviation fuel tanks. Then the second, the third, the fourth. The hits were so powerful that the 70,000-ton giant shuddered like a living creature taking a blow to the gut. Men sleeping in their bunks were thrown to the floor. The lights went out, replaced by an eerie red emergency glow. The air was instantly filled with the smell of smoke, oil, and ozone from fried wiring. But on the bridge, there was a strange calm. Toshio Abe held the railing, feeling the vibration of the deck. He heard the reports of the breaches. 4 hits in the starboard side. For any other ship, this would be death. But Abe was commanding the Shinano. In his head, a simple logic was at work. This is the hull of the Yamato. It has the best anti-torpedo protection in the world. A triple bottom, massive bulges, armored belts half a meter thick. Designers swore this ship could take 10 torpedoes and stay afloat. 4 torpedoes? It was an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Maintain course, he commanded. Speed unchanged, 18 knots. It was a decision dictated by pride. Abe believed that if he stopped, he would become an easy target for a follow-up attack. He believed in the armor. He believed in the myth of unsinkability. But he forgot that he wasn't commanding a finished battleship, but a floating construction site. Deep in the belly of the ship, a nightmare was unfolding that no admiral could have foreseen. The anti-torpedo protection worked. It took the blow. But the water found another way. You see, the Shinano was packed with kilometers of electrical cables. They passed through the watertight bulkheads through special holes. According to the rules, these holes were supposed to be sealed with special glands. But in the rush, with workers forced to work 20-hour days, these glands were simply never installed. Or the gaps were smeared with some temporary putty. When the water rushed into the breached compartments, it didn't stop at the steel walls. It simply leaked through them. Thousands of small holes for cables turned into thousands of small taps, opened at full blast. The carrier continued to move at 18 knots. And this turned the breaches into giant ram air intakes. The water pressure was monstrous. The ocean was literally being shoved inside the ship by the inertia of its own movement. In the engine rooms, men watched in horror as water began to seep from the walls, the ceiling, and the ventilation shafts. Hatches that were supposed to hold the pressure leaked at the seams. Their rubber seals were either dried out or missing. The doors were warped by the explosion and couldn't be bolted shut. Damage control officers tried to turn on the pumps. And then the worst was discovered. The pumps weren't even connected to the power grid yet. And the ones that did work didn't have hoses of the right length. The list to starboard began to grow. First 5 degrees, then 9, then 13. Abe on the bridge still thought he was in control. He sent a signal to the destroyers. Damage moderate, continuing movement. It was a lie he wanted to believe himself. But you can't cheat physics. Water filled the holds faster than the crew could realize what was happening. And most terrifyingly, because of the ship's secrecy, most of the sailors didn't even know its layout. They ran through a labyrinth of corridors in total darkness, trying to find an exit as the icy water rose to their throats. By dawn, the situation on board the Shinano had turned from an emergency into a catastrophe. The sun rose over the horizon, illuminating a surreal scene. The giant carrier, the pride of the empire, lay on its side like a wounded animal. The list reached 20 degrees. Walking on the deck became impossible. People crawled, clinging to protrusions and railings because the floor had become a wall. Inside the ship, absolute chaos reigned. And it was here, in these final hours, that the criminal negligence of the command was fully revealed. The crew, scraped together from wherever they could find men, simply didn't know how to fight for the ship's life. Officers gave orders that no one could carry out. The counterflooding system, the mechanism that was supposed to level the list by pumping water into the port-side compartments, proved to be non-functional. The valves were rusted shut or painted over during the rushed delivery. Sailors tore their hands to blood trying to turn the wheels, but they wouldn't budge. The pumps? That was a separate tragedy. The powerful stationary pumps failed because they hadn't been secured to their foundations. From the vibration, they simply broke loose. And the portable pumps Abe was counting on were useless. The hoses didn't fit. The connector diameters were different. Imagine the horror. You have a pump, you have a hose, but you can't connect them while the water rises to your knees. In desperation, men began to form chains and pass buckets of water. On board the most technological ship of 1944, capable of carrying 47 planes, the crew was trying to bail out the Pacific Ocean with tin buckets. At 8 o'clock, the list reached 30 degrees. The engines finally died. The massive hull of the Shinano lost headway and began to drift. The silence that followed the stopping of the turbines was scarier than the roar of the explosions. Now only the screams of men trapped in the lower compartments and the ominous screeching of metal that couldn't support its own weight could be heard. At 10:18, Captain Toshio Abe realized he had lost. He looked at the skewed horizon and gave his final order. Begin evacuation. Save the Emperor's portrait. In Japanese tradition, the sacred portrait of Hirohito was more important than the life of any sailor. It was carefully lowered into a boat and sent to a destroyer. Only then were the men allowed to leave the ship. But escaping was not easy. The carrier was immense. The height of the hull was like a 5-story building. Descending down the slippery, oil-covered armor while the ship was collapsing on you was deadly. Men jumped into the water, breaking bones, or fell from the heights. At 10:55, the Shinano shuddered one last time. Water rushed into the open aircraft elevator shaft. This was the final straw. Gravity won. The giant slowly, almost majestically, rolled over keel up. The massive flight deck hit the water, creating a wave that washed over hundreds of floating heads. Those who hadn't made it out of the holds were trapped. They lived for a few more minutes in air pockets, hearing the ocean crush the steel around them. At 10:57, the ship's bow reared vertically into the sky, like a tombstone, and the Shinano began to sink rapidly into the abyss. Captain Toshio Abe did not leave the bridge. He tied himself to the wheel. Beside him stayed the watch officer, who refused to leave without his commander. They went to the bottom with their unfinished, untrained, and betrayed ship. Along with them, 1,435 people died. Sailors, workers, engineers, people who became hostages to the greatest military secret in Japan. Deep in the ocean, sounds echoed that would make even the most seasoned submariner's blood run cold. The Archerfish crew sat in silence, listening to the hydrophones. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of a giant tin can being crushed. Bulkheads burst under the water pressure. Air roared as it escaped. Steel groaned and screeched. The Shinano was dying loudly. Joseph Enright wrote in the logbook, "Target destroyed," presumably a large aircraft carrier. But when Archerfish returned to base, the hero was met not with flowers, but with disbelief. Intelligence officers in Pearl Harbor looked at Enright's report and laughed. "Joe, you've spent too much time in the sun," they said. "You claim to have sunk a ship with a displacement of 70,000 tons? The Japanese don't have ships like that. We know about Yamato and Musashi, but the third hull was frozen. You probably sank a converted tanker or an escort carrier. 28,000 tons at most." Enright was furious. He knew what he saw. He drew a sketch from memory. The massive deck, the strange superstructure, the powerful hull lines. But they didn't believe him. In official documents, they credited him with sinking an unidentified aircraft carrier, cutting the tonnage by 2/3. They gave him a medal, but with a footnote. For displayed aggressiveness, not for destroying a strategic target. The truth only surfaced after the surrender of Japan, when American officers entered Tokyo and began studying the secret archives of the Imperial Navy. One of the analysts stumbled upon a folder marked "Top Secret." He opened it and turned pale. There were the blueprints for Hull 110, the Shinano, a monster that U.S. intelligence hadn't even suspected existed. Comparing the coordinates of its sinking with the Archerfish report, the admirals realized the massive mistake they had made by not believing their captain. It was a shock. A single submarine, out on a free hunt from boredom, had accidentally destroyed the largest, most powerful, and most expensive ship in the Japanese fleet. It was the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine in human history, and that record has not been broken to this day. The fate of the Shinano is a perfect metaphor for the entire Japanese military machine at the end of the war. Grandiose ambitions embodied in steel. Incredible technical solutions shattered by harsh reality, lack of resources, and human error. It was created to be invincible. It was called the nation's hope. But in the end, it existed at sea for only 17 hours. It never launched a single plane. its guns were silent. Thousands of people died not in a heroic battle, but in dark, flooded corridors, never even understanding what had happened. The greatest secret of Japan only stopped being a secret when it became a mass grave at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Today, looking at this story, we understand one simple thing. No amount of armor, no secret technology, and no amount of steel can save you if the system inside is ruled by chaos, fear, and haste. The Shinano didn't sink because of 4 torpedoes. It sank because of the hubris of those who thought the laws of physics could be cancelled by the Emperor's order. That is where the story of the ghost of the ocean ends. But the ocean holds many more secrets. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next dive into history.